Deep within the rolling hills of Natal in South Africa lies a history that is often whispered but rarely spoken aloud. The year was 1906, and the air was thick with tension and the humidity of the approaching summer. It was a time when the modern world was beginning to encroach upon ancient lands, but the old spirits and darker forces still held sway in the shadows. The local Zulu population lived in a delicate balance between their traditional beliefs and the spreading influence of colonial missionaries. Among the mission stations scattered across this rugged landscape was Marianhill, which would soon become the epicenter of a terrifying series of events. This was not merely a case of hysteria or simple illness, but something far more sinister that would challenge the faith of even the most devout believers. The darkness that descended here was palpable and heavy. The story centers on a young girl named Clara Germana Cele, who was just 16 years old at the time of these harrowing events. She was an orphan of Zulu descent who had been taken in by the sisters at the St. Michael's Mission. To the outside observer, Clara appeared to be a normal and unassuming teenager who was grateful for the education and shelter provided by the mission. She was baptized as an infant and raised in the Catholic faith, which made the subsequent events all the more shocking to the community. There were no early warning signs of the corruption that would eventually consume her soul. She attended Mass and participated in daily chores and interacted with the other students without incident. However, beneath this facade of normalcy, a profound spiritual rot was beginning to take hold. It was a silent invasion that would soon erupt into violence. It is said that the trouble began not with an external attack, but with an internal invitation that Clara extended to the darkness. In a moment of frustration, or perhaps misguided curiosity, the young girl made a pact with Satan. While the specific details of this transaction remain shrouded in mystery, Clara later confessed to Father Erasmus Horner that she had willingly handed over her will to the adversary. This confession came only after the entity had fully entrenched itself within her. The change in her demeanor was not immediate, but gradual, like the slow creep of a shadow across a floor. At first, it was a subtle shift in her eyes, which seemed to hold a malice that did not belong to a teenage girl. The other children at the mission began to avoid her, instinctively sensing a predatory aura that now surrounded their former friend. The first undeniable signs of her possession manifested in ways that the nuns could not explain through medical science or adolescent rebellion. Clara began to exhibit a repulsion to holy objects that was violent and visceral. When a crucifix was brought near her, she would recoil, as if physically burned by an unseen fire. The mere presence of holy water would send her into fits of rage that required multiple adults to restrain her. She would spit and hiss at the sisters who tried to comfort her, and her voice would drop several octaves to a guttural growl that sounded nothing like a human female. This was the beginning of a nightmare that would plague the mission for weeks. The sanctity of the church grounds had been breached by a profane force that delighted in the fear it caused. As the weeks progressed, the phenomena surrounding Clara Germana Cele escalated from disturbing behaviors to impossible feats. She began to speak in languages that she had never learned and had no way of knowing. Witnesses reported hearing her converse fluently in Latin and German, and even ancient dialects that had not been spoken for centuries. This xenoglossy is often cited by the Vatican as a primary sign of demonic possession. The nuns and priests at Marianhill were German missionaries, and they were horrified to hear their native tongue being twisted and defiled by the entity speaking through the Zulu girl. The voice mocked them and revealed their secret sins, and laughed with a chilling resonance that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls of the mission. It was clear that Clara was no longer the one in control. Beyond the linguistic impossibilities, Clara demonstrated a terrifying form of clairvoyance that stripped away the privacy of everyone around her. She could see things that were happening at great distances and describe them with pinpoint accuracy. She knew the movements of people who were miles away and could recount conversations that had taken place behind closed doors. This power was used to torment those who tried to help her. She would reveal the hidden shames and private thoughts of the nuns and priests, forcing them to face their own spiritual inadequacies while battling for her soul. The psychological warfare was relentless and designed to break the will of the clergy. The entity wanted them to feel hopeless and exposed and vulnerable in the face of its ancient knowledge. The physical manifestations of the possession were even more alarming and defied the laws of physics. Clara would demonstrate superhuman strength that was impossible for a girl of her slight frame. There were instances where she would toss heavy furniture across the room with a mere flick of her wrist. During her fits, it would take up to 6 grown men to hold her down. And even then, they struggled against the raw power coursing through her limbs. Her body would contort into unnatural positions that should have broken her bones. Her joints would pop and twist backwards, and her spine would arch to a sickening degree. The sound of her bones grinding and snapping echoed in the small rooms of the mission, creating a symphony of body horror that haunted the witnesses for years. The most terrifying aspect of the physical phenomena was the levitation. Witnesses, including Father Erasmus Horner and Father Mansut, documented seeing Clara rise 5 feet into the air. She would float vertically and sometimes horizontally, while her clothes remained stiff and unmoving, as if defying gravity themselves. This was not a simple jump or a trick of the light, but a sustained suspension in the air. While hovering, she would often adopt a cross-legged posture or hang limply like a puppet on unseen strings. The priests would sprinkle holy water on her floating form, which would cause her to crash violently back to the floor. The sight of a human being defying gravity sent waves of primal fear through everyone present, confirming that they were dealing with forces beyond the natural world. Father Erasmus Horner was the priest in charge of the mission, and he knew that an exorcism was the only course of action left. He petitioned the bishop for permission to perform the Roman ritual. The permission was granted, and the date was set for the rite of exorcism. It was to be a battle of wills between the servants of God and the agent of darkness. The atmosphere at St. Michael's Mission was heavy with dread as the day approached. The priests prepared themselves through fasting and prayer, knowing that they were about to step into a ring with a beast that had destroyed countless souls. They gathered their vestments and the holy water and the crucifix and the book of rites. The air in the room chosen for the exorcism felt freezing cold, despite the South African heat. The exorcism of Clara Germana Cele began in the early morning hours and would stretch on for 2 harrowing days. As soon as Father Erasmus Horner began the prayers, the entity inside Clara reacted with explosive violence. She lunged at the priest with a ferocity that was meant to kill. The men assigned to restrain her were thrown aside like ragdolls. She bit and clawed and screamed obscenities that were too vile to repeat. The priest stood his ground and continued the Latin incantations while clutching his rosary. The room filled with a stench of sulfur and rotting flesh that made it difficult to breathe. This olfactory manifestation is common in severe cases of possession and serves to disorient and sicken the exorcists. During the ritual, Clara tried to strangle Father Erasmus Horner with his own stole. She displayed a cunning intelligence and waited for a moment of distraction to strike. Her hands clamped around his throat with a vice-like grip, and it took the combined effort of the other assistants to pry her fingers loose. The priest gasped for air, but did not stop the prayers. He knew that any sign of weakness would be exploited by the demon. The entity mocked his faith and told him that his prayers were useless. It claimed ownership over the girl and stated that she belonged to the darkness now. The battle was not just physical, but deeply psychological, as the demon tried to convince the priest of the futility of his mission. One of the most disturbing events occurred when the entity manifested as a serpentine force within Clara. Her body began to move and slither along the floor like a snake. Her jaw unhinged, and she hissed with a sound that was unmistakably reptilian. She struck out and bit the arm of one of the nuns, leaving marks that resembled the puncture wounds of a viper. The area around the bite instantly swelled and turned a dark purple, indicating a venomous reaction, despite Clara being a human girl. The nun cried out in agony as the poison seemed to spread through her veins. Father Erasmus Horner quickly blessed the wound with holy water, and the swelling miraculously subsided. This was a clear sign that the physical injuries were spiritual in nature. The levitation continued throughout the exorcism, with Clara rising to the ceiling of the chapel. She clung to the rafters like a spider and looked down at the priests with eyes that burned with a red luminescence. She spat a corrosive fluid down onto them that ruined their vestments and burned their skin. The priests had to dodge these attacks while maintaining the rhythm of the ritual. The scene was chaotic and terrifying, with the girl defying gravity and physics, while the men of God chanted below. It was a tableau of good versus evil brought to life in the most dramatic way possible. The endurance of the priests was tested to the absolute limit as the hours dragged on into the night. At one point, the demon tried to escape the room by smashing through the heavy wooden doors. Clara threw herself against the barricade with such force that the wood splintered and cracked. The sound was like a cannon blast in the confined space. The assistants had to pile benches and heavy furniture against the door to keep her contained. The entity screamed in frustration and turned its rage back toward the people in the room. It seemed desperate to flee the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, which had been brought in to assist with the rite. The power of the host caused the girl to writhe in agony, as if she were being crushed by a great weight. The exorcism reached a critical point when the entity attempted to deceive the priests by pretending to leave. Clara suddenly went limp and fell to the floor, appearing to be unconscious. Her breathing returned to normal, and the tension in the room dissipated. Father Erasmus Horner was cautious and did not stop the prayers. He knew that the Father of Lies often used this tactic to catch the exorcist off guard. Suddenly, Clara sprang up with a renewed vigor and laughed maniacally. She boasted that she had fooled them and that she would never leave. This psychological feint was a devastating blow to the morale of the team, but they refused to give up hope. As the second day of the exorcism dawned, the priests were exhausted and battered. They had not slept or eaten, and their voices were hoarse from the constant chanting. The entity seemed to draw energy from their fatigue, growing stronger as they grew weaker. It revealed that there were actually a legion of spirits inhabiting the girl, not just one. They spoke in a chorus of discordant voices that created a cacophony of madness. Each voice had a distinct tone and personality, but all were united in their hatred for the sacred. The complexity of the possession made the task of expulsion infinitely harder, as each spirit had to be named and cast out individually. Finally, after hours of grueling spiritual warfare, the tide began to turn. Father Erasmus Horner commanded the demon to depart in the name of the Holy Trinity. He pressed the crucifix against the chest of the girl and demanded that the entity leave her body. Clara let out a scream that shattered the windows of the chapel. It was a sound of pure anguish and defeat. Her body arched one last time in a rigid bow and then collapsed onto the floor. A dark mist was seen by some witnesses to exit her mouth and dissipate into the shadows. The oppressive atmosphere in the room lifted, instantly replaced by a sense of profound peace. Clara lay on the floor, weeping softly. She was disoriented and had no memory of the violence she had committed or the things she had said. She looked at her bruised hands and the wrecked room with confusion. The priests rushed to her side to offer comfort and check her vital signs. She was physically exhausted and covered in sweat, but she was herself again. The dark presence that had occupied her eyes was gone, replaced by the innocent gaze of the 16-year-old girl she was. It was a moment of immense relief for everyone involved. The nightmare was over, but the scars of the ordeal would remain. However, the story of Clara Germana Cele does not have a long and happy ending. Although she was freed from the demonic possession, her physical health never fully recovered from the trauma. The strain placed on her heart and body during the violent fits had taken a severe toll. She lived for another 6 years after the exorcism, remaining at the mission and living a life of quiet piety. She was deeply grateful to the priests who had saved her and dedicated her remaining time to prayer. But the shadow of her experience always lingered in the background, a reminder of the abyss she had stared into. In 1912, at the young age of 22, Clara Germana Cele passed away from heart failure. Her death was peaceful and starkly different from the chaos of her possession. She was buried in the cemetery at Marianhill Mission, where her grave remains to this day. Her story became a local legend and was eventually documented in the annals of the Catholic Church in South Africa. It stands as one of the most well-documented cases of demonic possession in the 20th century. The detailed records kept by Father Erasmus Horner and the other witnesses provide a chilling account of the reality of spiritual warfare. The case of Clara Germana Cele serves as a stark reminder of the mysteries that lie beyond the veil of our understanding. In the modern world, we often dismiss such accounts as superstition or mental illness. Yet the witnesses to these events were educated men and women who saw things that defied all rational explanation. The levitation and the xenoglossy and the supernatural strength are phenomena that science struggles to explain. The story challenges us to consider the possibility that there are forces in this universe that are malevolent and active. It forces us to look into the dark corners of history where the light of reason flickers and fades. Today, the Marianhill Mission still stands in the quiet hills of Natal. The room where the exorcism took place is no longer used for such purposes, the memory of those 2 days in 1900, and 6 remains etched in the stone. Visitors to the mission often report feeling a strange chill when walking near the old chapel. Some say that the energy of the battle between good and evil left a permanent mark on the location. It is a place where the veil between worlds feels thin, and where the silence is heavy with the weight of the past. The story of Clara is told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about the dangers of inviting darkness into one's life. The legacy of this possession extends beyond the borders of South Africa. It has been studied by demonologists and theologians around the world. The similarities between Clara's case and the famous case of Marianhill Mission in Germany, or the story that inspired The Exorcist, are striking. They all follow a similar pattern of infestation and oppression and possession. They all involve the same repulsion to the sacred and the same superhuman abilities. This consistency across different cultures and time periods suggests a singular underlying reality. It suggests that the entity Clara faced was the same ancient evil that has plagued humanity for millennia. One must also consider the cultural context of the events. This happened in a land where traditional Zulu spirituality and colonial Catholicism were colliding. Some skeptics argue that the possession was a manifestation of this cultural conflict, a psychological break caused by the pressure to assimilate. Yet this explanation fails to account for the physical impossibilities witnessed by so many. Mass hysteria cannot explain levitation or the knowledge of secret sins. It cannot explain the bite marks that swelled with venom or the speaking of ancient languages. The evidence points to something external, something that invaded Clara from the outside. The terrifying reality of Clara Germana Cele is that she was an ordinary girl. She was not a villain or a saint, but a teenager who made a mistake. Her story illustrates the spiritual danger of curiosity and the very real consequences of engaging with the occult. It is a warning that the doors we open cannot always be easily closed. The pact she made, whether real or imagined by a troubled mind, became a gateway for destruction. It serves as a grim lesson on the vulnerability of the human soul. We like to think we are safe in our modern lives, but Clara's story suggests that the wall protecting us is thinner than we think. As we reflect on this dark chapter of history, we are left with more questions than answers. What really happened in that small room in Natal? Was it a battle against a literal demon from hell, or a manifestation of the dark potential within the human mind? Perhaps the distinction does not matter. The terror experienced by Clara and those around her was real. The violence was real. The evil was real. Whether it came from within or without, the result was the same. A young life was consumed, and a community was traumatized. The priests who fought for Clara's soul are long gone, buried in the same earth as the girl they saved. Their records remain as a testament to their courage in the face of the unknown. They stood against a force that mocked their God and threatened their lives, and they did not falter. In a world that often celebrates skepticism, their unwavering faith in the face of absolute horror is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. They believed in the reality of the devil, and because of that belief, they were able to save a soul. It is a testament to the power of conviction. Even now, over a century later, the name Clara Germana Cele evokes a sense of unease in those who know her story. It is a name that belongs to the shadows, a name that carries the weight of a terrible secret. We recount her tale not to glorify the darkness, but to remember that the light is something that must be fought for. We tell it to remind ourselves that the battle between good and evil is not just a metaphor, but a struggle that is played out in flesh and blood. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten. As the sun sets over the hills of Natal, casting long shadows across the grounds of Marianhill, one can almost hear the echoes of that ancient struggle. The wind rustling through the trees sounds like a whisper from the past. It serves as a reminder that some histories are written in ink, and others are written in blood and fear. The story of the South African possession is one of the latter. It is a scar on the landscape of history, a dark mark that time cannot fully erase. So tonight, as you sit in the safety of your home and the darkness gathers outside, remember the girl from Natal. Remember the voices that spoke through her and the power that lifted her from the ground. Remember that the world is vast and full of mysteries that we may never fully comprehend. And if you hear a whisper in the dark or feel a sudden chill in the air, do not invite it in. For as Clara Germana Cele learned, the darkness is always listening, and it is always waiting for an invitation. The lingering dread of this case comes from the realization that evil is not bound by geography or time. It found a young girl in a remote mission station in 1906 and destroyed her life. It is a force that is predatory and patient. The silence that follows the story is not empty, but pregnant with the possibility of return. We turn away from the tale, hoping it is just a story, but deep down we fear that it is a glimpse into a reality we are too afraid to acknowledge. The darkness is out there, and it is hungry